the night he died in silence. What if I told you that one man's private decision, made in complete darkness, witnessed by no one, brought an instant response from heaven? No warning, no illness, no second chance. One moment he was alive, the next he was gone, and the Bible records in a single chilling sentence. Tonight, we step into that room, not to sensationalize it, but to understand why it mattered so much and why it still does. The story begins. There are stories in Scripture that comfort us, stories of forgiveness, stories of healing, stories where God waits patiently, calling people back again and again. And then there are stories that unsettle us, stories that don't come with explanations, stories that don't soften the edges, stories that leave us asking, how could this happen? The story of Onan is one of those. Most people have heard his name, but few truly understand what happened, or why it matters far beyond the ancient world. Because this is not just a story about sexuality. It is not just a story about law. It is not just a story about punishment. It is a story about what happens when someone touches something sacred and treats it as disposable, a death without a funeral. The Bible does not linger on Onan's death. There is no dramatic buildup, no long dialogue, no poetic lament. Just a single line in Genesis. What he did displeased the Lord, and he put him to death also. That's it. No appeal, no explanation, no delay. If we're honest, that sentence makes us uncomfortable, because we prefer a God who always explains himself, a God who always gives time, a God whose judgments feel predictable. But Scripture reminds us of something we often forget. God is not obligated to narrate his justice. Sometimes the silence is the message. The room no one saw. Picture the scene. An ordinary room in ancient Canaan. Stone walls, oil lamps flickering. A moment that should have carried hope, the possibility of life, of continuity, of legacy. No angels visible. No thunder. No witnesses. Just two people. And one decision. Onan believed what happened there would remain there, private, hidden, unaccountable. But Scripture insists on a sobering truth. Nothing sacred is ever truly private, especially when it involves covenant. Why the story survived. Thousands of men lived and died in Genesis without names, without stories, without consequence. So why was this one preserved? Why did the ancient scribes record this moment? Why did God allow this account to echo across centuries? Because Onan's story exposes something far deeper than a single act. It reveals a pattern of the human heart, one that still exists today, a pattern where people take what feels good, avoid what costs them, and call it wisdom. A man who knew better. Onan was not ignorant. He wasn't a stranger to God. He wasn't raised outside the covenant. He wasn't stumbling blindly into disobedience. He was born into promise. He knew the stories. He knew the responsibilities. He knew what was expected of him, which makes this story even more disturbing, because the most dangerous failures don't come from ignorance. They come from calculation. The weight of a name. In the ancient Hebrew world, your name was not just an identifier. It was your memory, your future, your place in the story of God's people. To die without offspring wasn't just tragic. It was erasure. And God had established a system to protect against that, not for convenience, not for culture, but for mercy, a duty that was more than duty. The responsibility placed on Onan was not romantic. It wasn't comfortable, and it wasn't profitable. It required him to put someone else's legacy above his own advantage, accept loss for the sake of faithfulness, serve without applause. And that's where the tension lives. Because obedience that costs nothing is rarely obedience at all. The moment of decision. Onan stood at a crossroads no one else could see. He could honor the purpose and lose something in return, or he could protect himself, quietly, subtly, without open rebellion. And that choice tells us something terrifying about the human heart. We don't usually reject God loudly. We reject him strategically. Why? He thought he'd get away with it. Onan did not wake up intending to defy heaven. He likely told himself stories we still tell today. This is reasonable. This is practical. God understands. But Scripture reminds us, God does not judge intentions the way humans do. He judges alignment. Not what you say you believe, but what your actions serve. The line that couldn't be crossed. What Onan touched wasn't just intimacy. It was inheritance. It was responsibility. It was a divine thread woven through generations. And when he chose to sever it for personal gain, heaven responded, not out of cruelty, but out of protection, because some things, when corrupted, must be stopped. Why this is not just an old story. We tell ourselves this story belongs to another time, another culture, another covenant. But the core question remains painfully current. What has God entrusted to you, and what are you doing with it? Not just possessions, not just talents, but influence, opportunity, responsibility. Because spiritual failure rarely looks like rebellion. It looks like using sacred things without honoring their purpose. A question that lingers. Onan's story ends abruptly, but its echo doesn't. It asks every generation the same question. Will you serve the form or the purpose? Will you keep appearances or surrender your advantage? Because what happens next in this story, with Tamar, with Judah, with the unfolding plan of redemption, only makes sense once we understand why this moment mattered so deeply. And that's where the story truly begins. The law behind the story. To understand why that moment in the darkness mattered so deeply, we have to step back, far back, into the world Onan lived in. In ancient Israel, life was never just individual. No one belonged only to themselves. Every person was a link in a chain, a carrier of promise, a steward of something larger than their own comfort. That's why God established what later became known as Levirate marriage. It wasn't romance. It wasn't convenience. It was responsibility. When a man died without a son, his brother was commanded to take the widow and raise offspring in the name of the deceased. That child would not primarily belong to the living brother. He would belong to the one who had died. The inheritance, the name, the future, all preserved. In God's eyes, this was not an outdated custom. It was an act of mercy. Why this law existed. In the ancient world, a widow without children had almost no protection, no land, no income, no lasting place in society. To be childless was to live suspended, belonging nowhere, dependent on others' goodwill. God saw that vulnerability, so he created a system that protected the widow, honored the dead, preserved family identity, and safeguarded the unfolding promise to Abraham. This law wasn't about control. It was about care. And Onan knew this, a man who understood the stakes. Onan wasn't confused about what was required. He understood that if Tamar bore a son, that child would legally inherit his brother's portion. The family estate would be divided. His own future wealth would shrink. And that's where the real battle began. Not between obedience and rebellion, but between faithfulness and self-interest. Because obedience, when it costs nothing, is easy. But obedience that threatens your advantage, that exposes the heart. The silent calculation. Scripture doesn't describe Onan as violent. It doesn't call him cruel. It doesn't portray him as openly defiant. That's what makes his story so unsettling. His sin wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was calculated. He gave Tamar the appearance of obedience, but he withheld the purpose. And in doing so, he reduced a sacred responsibility into a tool for personal gain. This is where many people missed the point. Onan didn't reject God outright. He used God's system while refusing God's intention. Half obedience, the most dangerous form. From the outside, Onan looked compliant. He showed up. He performed the act. He fulfilled the visible requirement. But heaven doesn't measure obedience by appearance. God weighs motives. And what he saw was this: a man willing to receive pleasure while denying legacy. A man willing to touch the covenant without carrying its weight. That kind of obedience isn't partial. It's deceptive when no one else could see. The most chilling part of this story is not the judgment. It's the secrecy. No court, no witnesses, no accusation. Tamar could suspect, but she couldn't prove, and Onan likely believed that silence was safety. But Scripture repeatedly reminds us, God sees what human systems cannot. And when injustice hides behind privacy, God becomes the witness. Tamar, the forgotten victim. It's easy to focus on Onan and forget Tamar. But heaven didn't forget her. She was trapped, bound to a family that would not fulfill its duty, unable to move forward, unable to speak freely. Night after night, she was used but never restored, given intimacy but denied dignity. This wasn't just disobedience. It was exploitation. And when exploitation wears the mask of legality, God intervenes. Why the judgment was immediate? People often ask, why was God so severe here? The answer is uncomfortable. Because this sin had a victim. God is patient with weakness, but he is swift when the vulnerable are deliberately harmed. This wasn't a moment of failure. It was a pattern of manipulation, and God ended it. A cosmic thread. There's another layer to this story, one that stretches far beyond Onan's lifetime. Onan belonged to the line of Judah. From that line would come kings. From that line would come David. And from that line would come the Messiah. Every generation mattered. Every interruption threatened the promise. By sabotaging that lineage, Onan wasn't just protecting his wealth. He was interfering with something eternal. And God would not allow that thread to be severed in silence. The paradox that terrifies us. Here's the truth that makes modern readers uneasy. Onan didn't look like a villain. He looked like many of us. Reasonable, practical, self-protective. He didn't curse God. He didn't abandon faith. He simply tried to obey without losing anything. And Scripture tells us plainly, faith that costs nothing produces nothing. The cost he never calculated. Onan measured what obedience would cost him, but he never measured what disobedience would cost others. He calculated inheritance, but not consequence. And that's the danger of private sin. It always feels contained, until it isn't. The myth of personal autonomy. Our modern world tells us, it's your life, your body, your choice. But the biblical worldview says something radically different. You are entrusted, not owned. Your life is a stewardship. Your gifts are deposits. Your influence is borrowed. And when something entrusted is used selfishly, it becomes theft, even if no one else notices. The heart of the sin. This is why generations misunderstood Onan's story. They focused on the act. God focused on the heart. The true offense wasn't physical. It was covenantal. Onan treated something holy as expendable, and that is a line Scripture never treats lightly. A mirror for every generation. That's why this story refuses to stay buried in Genesis, because the question it raises is timeless. Where are we maintaining form while denying substance? Where are we enjoying blessing while resisting responsibility? Where are we touching sacred things, time, relationships, calling, without letting them produce fruit? A warning, not a relic. Onan's death isn't preserved to scare us into obedience. It's preserved to wake us up, to remind us that God is not impressed by appearances. He is moved by faithfulness. And when we step into the next part of this story, what happens to Tamar, how God redeems what was broken, and how judgment makes room for mercy, we begin to see something astonishing. Even when humans fail catastrophically, God's purpose does not die, and that truth carries us forward into the next chapter, when the story refuses to end. The story of Onan does not end where his life ended. His name disappears from the genealogy, but his warning does not. It lingers, not as a threat, but as a mirror. Because long after the ancient laws faded, long after the tents of Canaan collapsed into dust, the human heart did not change. We are still tempted to obey just enough, to serve selectively, to surrender publicly while withholding privately. And Scripture keeps this story alive to confront that instinct, a God who sees in secret. One of the most unsettling truths in the Bible is this. God sees what no one else sees, not just actions, intentions, not just behavior, motives. Onan believed his decision will remain invisible. But the God of Scripture is not confined to temples, courts, or crowds. He enters bedrooms. He weighs silence. He judges secrets. And that truth should both humble us and comfort us. Because the same God who sees hidden selfishness also sees hidden faithfulness. Judgment that protects. It is tempting to read this story and conclude that God is harsh. But Scripture tells a deeper story. God did not act to destroy a man for pleasure. He acted to stop an injustice. Tamar had no advocate, no voice, no power. And when human systems failed her, heaven intervened. This is a pattern throughout the Bible. God is slow to anger, but swift to defend the vulnerable. Judgment, in this case, was not cruelty. It was protection. The redemption on the other side. What makes this story even more astonishing is what happens next. God does not abandon Tamar. From her pain, from her humiliation, from the injustice done to her, redemption emerges. She will later become part of the very lineage Onan tried to sabotage. Her name will be remembered. Her role will be honored. And through her line, kings will rise. This is how God works. Human selfishness does not cancel divine purpose. It may delay it. It may wound people along the way, but it will not stop it. The question left for us, and now the story turns toward us, because Scripture is not primarily about ancient people. It is about eternal patterns. So the question Onan leaves behind is not, what did he do? But, where am I doing the same? Where am I keeping the appearance of obedience but denying its cost? Enjoying blessing without embracing responsibility? Touching sacred things without allowing them to bear fruit? The most dangerous deception. The greatest danger is not rebellion. It is self-deception. False obedience feels safe. It reassures us. It lets us believe we are faithful when we are merely compliant. Jesus confronted this directly. People who prayed, people who served, people who spoke his name. And yet he said, I never knew you, not because they failed publicly, but because they never surrendered fully. What God desires. God does not ask for perfection. He asks for wholeness, an undivided heart, a sincere surrender, a faith willing to lose in order to obey. He is not impressed by what we keep. He is moved by what we release. Because faith that is never costly is faith that has never been tested. The final invitation. Onan's life ended abruptly. Ours is not, which means this story is not a sentence. It is an invitation to examine what we have been entrusted with, an invitation to release what we have been hoarding, an invitation to stop negotiating obedience, because the God who judged Onan is the same God who offers mercy today. But mercy is not permission to remain unchanged. It is an opportunity to choose differently, a moment of honesty. So pause, not to analyze theology, not to judge the past, but to listen. If there is any area where you have been obeying halfway, any place where you have preserved comfort at the cost of purpose, any sacred trust you have been withholding, this story calls you gently but firmly to respond. Not tomorrow, not later, now. The story's final word. Onan never heard these words, but you still can. Well done, good and faithful servant. Not faithful in appearance, not faithful in public, faithful in truth. Because a legacy that truly matters is not what we keep for ourselves, but what we allow God produce through us. And that is the story that still lives.